Hey folks, welcome back to the channel, Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk all the time about the Beatles and welcome special guests to the channel. This time, indeed, a very special guest. It's Ivor Davis, who accompanied the Beatles while they were on tour in the US in 1964. He also covered the West Coast dates of the Beatles in the US in 1965, and he's just released a book. Actually, this is a revised edition of his book, which is called The Beatles and Me on Tour, the 60th Anniversary Edition. Welcome, Ivor.
Thank you, Ken. Delightful to be on and to talk about our favorite pop group.
Let's just talk about and remind me when we get to the end of this interview, there's so many other incredible things that you have done in your career and people that you've interviewed and court trials that you covered. I don't want to miss talking about that, at least briefly, towards the end, because the Beatles were just one part of it all, but to a lot of people, it'll always be the most important. So
Yes.
why don't you talk about how this whole thing started, how you got to cover the 64 tour? You were working for the Daily Express
Correct.
in London.
Yeah. Um, I'll try and keep this answer very short, and you can cut me off whenever you feel like it, Ken. In 1964, I had just become foreign correspondent on the West Coast of America for the London Daily Express. And those were the days, I don't know if you remember them, but some of your listeners may remember when people actually read newspapers. They had them in their hot little hands and they read them. Now it's all online, nearly. I was West Coast correspondent for the London Daily Express. I got a call from my London editor, Sir David English, and he said, get on the plane to San Francisco. The boys are showing up within 3 hours, and I want you to be there. He said, you'll be traveling with them. We've arranged it with Brian Epstein, their manager. You'll be traveling with them. You'll be eating with them, drinking with them. And also, we want you to write George Harrison's column for him. And I thought, first of all, when he said the boys, I wasn't too sure who he was talking about. Of course, he was talking about the Beatles. They weren't that famous in America. They'd been on the Ed Sullivan Show earlier in the year. So I knew very little about them. I mean, I know this sounds amazing, Ken, but you've got to remember, 1964, middle of 64, they'd been on the Ed Sullivan Show. They were a sensation, but America still didn't know who they were. And we did not have the internet, and we did not have impeccable, instantaneous communications. So I said to the office, send me some clippings about them. I mean, that bad. And you couldn't go online and punch in the Beatles and get it. So they sent me some clippings, and then I fished around and discovered that they were quite big. And I knew nothing about them. So when I got to San Francisco in August of 1964, I went straight to the hotel. I think it was the Hilton Hotel in San Francisco. And there were about 300 girls screaming. And I thought, what's going on here? I mean, I know this sounds rather ignorant of me, but I didn't know what to expect. So I finally get into the desk and I say, I'd like the room for the next 3 nights. And they said, it's full up. I said, but I'm with the Beatles. And that was the magic answer. And they actually gave me a room, and I was off and running on what turned out to be, in reflection, and I didn't know it at the time, the most incredible story that I've ever really worked on. And I've worked on quite a few incredible stories. So I'm sorry for your long-winded answer, Ken, but there it is.
Oh, you can talk as long as you want. But
Yeah.
prior to this, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you've interviewed many celebrities, but you weren't really entertainment based, right? You were more serious subjects.
Well, I mean, I did serious stuff, but don't forget, I was the Hollywood West Coast correspondent. And when you talk about Hollywood, the Brits were fascinated with Hollywood. So, but honestly, I was not really trained for this. I was working, and I was very lucky to land the job. And I knew that the Daily Express wanted showbiz. And again, I mean, I took every story as it came along. And over the years, I covered just about every major movie star of that era, fortunately. But the Beatles, and it took me 40 years, Ken, to realize what a great story this was, because I never wrote about it. I went on to the next story. I mean, after I left the Beatles in late '64, I ended up writing about the Warren Commission report on the death of President John Kennedy. So it was crazy, and I didn't know what I was in for. And it's only years later that I realized, wow, what a ride I had and what a ride I was about to have. So the answer to your question is we didn't know much about the Beatles. I knew even less, but I enjoyed it and didn't appreciate my enjoyment until years later.
Well, even though, as you say, we didn't have instantaneous information like we do today, you couldn't escape hearing the Beatles on the radio in that first half of 1964 and from then on. So you really weren't familiar with their music or anything at that point?
And the only thing I was familiar with, and I realized there was magic happening, was when I tuned in with 74 million other people in February 1964 to see them on the Ed Sullivan Show. Um, and even then, I watched that, and although I'm interested in music, I'm no expert. I
Hmm.
didn't say, "Wow." And I knew a bit music. I grew up in England. I knew Cliff Richard, who came before them, and Tommy Steele, who came before them, and some of the Bill Haley and his Comets, and that was about it. And I was pretty ignorant about music. I mean, I hate to say that, and I'm still pretty ignorant about music, although I like it a lot more. So that was, I mean, it's hard to imagine that they sent a guy like me. You would think I had to be a rock critic to go, but I was the only guy on the West Coast. I was the first guy that could get to San Francisco quickly within 2 hours. And that's how I got the job. I mean, it is a pure, unadulterated fluke that I'm talking about it now, believe me.
So many people would have died to have been in your shoes, Ivor. Um,
Yeah, but don't forget this, Ken, that you didn't know in a way. I mean, you'd seen the impact of them on the Ed Sullivan Show, but you didn't know that they were going to conquer America in the way they did.
hmm.
And so I would rather beg to differ with what you just said, because they were hugely successful on the Ed Sullivan Show, and then even though the music came over, we weren't, we weren't ready for the Beatles. And then I discovered in '64 that the fall of '64, we were ready for the Beatles, and the fans went crazy.
Yeah, well, I've often said on my podcast shows and here on my channel that in 1964 nobody knew the Beatles were going to last as long as they did. Nobody knew that the music would endure for as long as it has. The thought at the time for most pop artists was they'd last a few years and that's it. And the Beatles even said that themselves.
Yes,
So,
they did. I don't want to interrupt you, but I remember at the end of the tour, when we said farewell to them and they headed back to England, I asked John what he was going to do, and I asked Paul what they were going to do, and they both said, "Well, we'll probably write music for other pop people."
right.
And Ringo said, "I'll take this money," and they earned quite good money, "and I'll open a hairdressing salon for my girlfriend." And who do I miss out? Ringo. I mean, Ringo didn't know what he was going to do, but at the end of the tour, Ringo was almost the most popular guy, because they had, as we left at the airport, they left to go back to Liverpool in England. There were signs that sang "Ringo for President." So Ringo was an instant hit. And it's great to look at history 60 years later, Ken, and you know this,
Hmm,
and you look at history and you say, "Wow, if I'd only known then what I know now, it
right.
would have been a different thing." So it's post things.
Now, when you spent all that time traveling with them in 64, you must have taken notes down to cover everything. Did you ever record any audio with any of them? Like you wrote, ghost wrote the column for George Harrison. Was that through his own words, or did you record that, or did you just jot it down, or how did that work?
Well, I mean, in those days, reporters reported and wrote, photographers took pictures, and we didn't double up. And I didn't have a tape recorder. I took notes of that. I mean, I know this sounds difficult. I mean, I didn't have a tape recorder. I never owned a tape recorder on that trip. I wish I had,
Hmm,
because guys like, Larry Kane,
sure.
and Art Schreiber, who worked for radio stations, stuck the microphone under the Beatles' noses and they talked their heads off. I mean, you've heard them all, and
Yes.
all these New York DJs. But I was a newspaper writer, and I would take notes of everything. And it's like the Souvenirs. I never bothered to keep any of those silly wigs that the Beatles they sold. And I kiddingly say my only regret, Ken, of traveling with the Beatles in 1964 was that I never took my iPhone camera with me because, of course, they weren't invented. So there are so many regrets. I mean, I wish I'd had more pictures taken with them. I wish I'd recorded them. I recorded a lot of movie stars over the years, and then I recorded them, would you believe, on those old-fashioned reelers, the tape ones that often get stuck.
Uh-huh.
And about 25 years ago, all my movie star interviews, we were in the garage in a box. 25 years ago, I thought, what am I going to do with these? And believe it or not, and I cry today, I threw them all away. I mean, I interviewed with Tom Cruise, Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, all those people I dumped. How stupid of that was me. Anyway, so there it is. You don't know. You've got to have an eye to the future. And so the short answer to your question was, I didn't tape it. I wrote it down. And particularly whenever I spoke to George, when he got out of bed in time, I wrote it down. And the only good thing is I've got my stories from my newspaper daily in England, and that's my saving grace.
Okay. So every day as you're jotting down notes, you're phoning them over in London, telling them what's going on.
That's what we did. We didn't have computers. We had to get on the phone and and dictate a story if there was a riot at the stadium, I think in New Orleans, and the cops ran over the fans and trampled them, and people were injured, and they stopped the show in Cleveland. I would get on the phone and dictate my story to some copy taker, and the London. I don't want to get too involved, but my London Daily Express copy tapers were a pain in the you-know-where. They would say to me, I'm in the middle of a big story, and they would say, Mr. Davis, is there much more of this coming? Is there? Like, get off the bloody phone. I mean, it's hard to believe that I'm phoning these great stories and the copy takers who couldn't care less about news were telling me to finish this damn thing and get on with it, let them get on with their life. That was the way it was. So the answer to your question again is, I would write my story and then I would dictate it to London, and they would give it to the editor, and it would be in the paper 2 hours later.
Okay. And I guess later on, when you decided you were going to make a book, all these articles were stored on, I guess, microfilm?
Yes, they were stored, and I had to get somebody to go to the newspaper and photocopy them and send them to me, and I've got them all. And thank heavens, because that was my gold storage.
Uh-huh.
We didn't get newspapers the next day. We couldn't go online and click in and say, here's what I wrote, as you can today. And it's hard to imagine in today's technologically improved world, if you want to call it that you can call on to the Daily Express now, or to the New York Times or the Washington Post, and get the story instantaneously on your computer. So the answer to your question is, I had to get a researcher in London to go to the newspaper library, photocopy all the pictures and send them to me, and all the stories. So it was a different world.
Is everything that's in this book based on those articles, or are there some things where you added your own memories that are not?
Yes. Yes, the answer to your question was yes, because certain things I didn't write about. Because if there was a negativity factor, like, was there some suspicion at the Las Vegas hotel that the Beatles were hanging out with underage girls, I didn't write about it because I knew that Brian was monitoring these stories, and Brian was desperate to make sure the show, that the tour was a success. If it had been a flop, Brian would have killed himself. I kid you not. Brian was so immersed. And don't forget, Brian knew that Cliff Richard and Tommy Steele and all those other rock stars that came to America were not great successes. And he was so desperate to have his boys successful. So getting back to your original question, The answer is that I wrote all mostly good stories, but then later on when I did the book, I put in the stuff that I would never have put in my stories, because Brian would have said, why did you write about the mother complaining about their daughters in the room with the Beatles? There's no more room for you on the private jet, Ivor. Sorry, you knew that. But the other punchline on this, Michael, is that they became like family. We hung out with them. We walked into their room. I raided the minibar whenever we wanted to. There were no security guards for us on the same floor in the next door room. So it's like treating family. They became family. The Beatles became confident and comfortable with me. They knew I wasn't out to get them. You wouldn't have that happen today, I don't think, very rarely. And so I was able to get a better inside glimpse. And then later on, when I finally got around to writing my memoir of the Beatles, I could talk about some of these a bit more openly.
Okay. I want to just bounce off something you just said about Brian Epstein, because I remember hearing that when Sid Bernstein approached him with the idea of them playing Shea Stadium in '65, Brian at first was really worried because he was convinced that they couldn't sell out a stadium. And there were times in '64 when some of those shows didn't sell out, right?
That's correct. I think one of them that didn't sell out was at the Rimrock Stadium in Denver, mainly because it was a magnificent stadium in Denver, just outside Denver, but it was like 20 minutes, 30 minutes out. It was somewhat remote. And actually, they weren't all sold out. But 9 times out of 10, and I look back at the statistics, they were sold out. I mean, the Hollywood Bowl was sold out within 3 or 4 hours, and that holds 17,000 people or thereabouts. So Brian was always worried that if he charged too much for tickets, people wouldn't come, and he would rather give away cheap tickets to the Beatle fans than have empty seats. And this happened all the time. And Brian really, I mean, I ask you this, see if you can guess. I mean, you're an expert. So what do you think the cheapest seat was for a Beatle concert in the 60s, in a 64 tour? What was the cheapest ticket?
Probably $4 to $5.
Yeah. Well, it was about $2.50 to $3 a ticket. And the cheapest and the more expensive seats went up to $5.50. Wow. I mean, look at it today. I mean, look at Taylor Swift. I mean, if you pay $600, you get a fairly reasonable seat. That's inflation.
You can't get a snack for $5.
That's right. That's right. And the same, I don't want to go off. I know you asked the question, but I mean, with all the merchandising, they didn't know the value of merchandising. Brian didn't. I mean, you know the story of how he gave it away,
Right.
To Seal Tab, some guy who had and then Brian, when he discovered how wealthy you could get from merchandising, ended up with a lawsuit. I mean, do you know the story about when the guy from Seal Tab, Nicky Byrne or somebody like that, you probably do, showed up at Brian's office and gave Brian $10,000. Brian said, "Wow, this is terrific. How much of this do we give to you?" And Nicky said, "Brian, you get 10%, we get the rest." And then the penny dropped, and Brian suddenly looked grim and realized he'd made a blunder. And he actually took several years later in the courts of America to get some more money back. So, in today's world, you would say merchandising, of course. Look at the way Paul does it. I go to Paul's concerts. Look at the way Paul merchandises, and you're an expert. This happens to I mean, merchandising is huge, yes, but not really during the Beatle era.
Brian learned a valuable lesson at that
Big
time.
lesson, a hard lesson.
He did so much more good than bad. So
yes, oh yeah, yeah. And there's no doubt. I mean, Brian was in love with the Beatles. He would have taken them for nothing. He ended up getting, I think, 25% of the take, but he wasn't in it for the money, because when he saw them, as you know, at the Cavern Club, he immediately fell hook, line, and sinker in love with them. He just said, "These are the boys," and he cleaned them up, and he did all the things we know, right, and those Beatle aficionados know. Cleaned them up, told them to stop swearing, stop smoking on stage, and gave them those Savile Row tight suits and the whole image. So Brian really, I mean, I'm not knocking him, but Brian really was the guy that made the image.
I know you talked about it in the book, but how did you find working with Brian? Because initially, well, you said that he wasn't polite to media types, um, and he was not approachable, at least in the very beginning for you.
Yes.
What was it like working with him? Because later on, you realized Derek Taylor quit working from him and then came back to work for the Beatles. But how did you find dealing with Brian?
Well, one of the big advantages, in a way, I was very lucky that with Derek Taylor, who was the press guy on that 64 tour, worked for my old newspaper as a showbiz writer. And it was Derek Taylor who first saw in Manchester the Beatles performing, and he wrote a glowing report, and then Brian liked his glowing report in my newspaper and called him up, and as you know, he wrote A Cellar Full of Noise for Brian.
Right.
So Brian and Derek got off very well. They had their breakup later on, as I'm sure you know, at the end of the tour when Derek resigned. But Brian was very distant, but two things went for me. First of all, I'm Jewish, and so was Brian. And second of all, when Derek told Brian that, Brian then got Derek to call me in New Orleans on Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish Holy Day of Atonement, and say, Brian wants to go to the synagogue. Can you arrange for it? So I arranged for it for Brian to go with me on Yom Kippur, and Brian never showed up. He ended up going to New York. But then when Brian and I started talking, we both had a similar background, and he grew up in a business family. I grew up in a working class family, but we both spent time in the British Army doing what was called national service. And Brian had done national service, but he hated it. I wasn't crazy about it. I managed to survive the 2 years. Brian got out of the British Army after 5 months because I think his homosexuality enabled him to get out. So in a way, we kind of linked fairly well on that point of view. And he kept the secret of his homosexuality from everybody, but everybody knew what was going on. And but Brian was meticulous. Brian would tell the boys, don't put your hands in your pockets, stop smoking, stop, don't swear, and silly things like that. He was like their keeper, their control of their mannerisms. At least he tried, and it was very hard to do with 4 boisterous guys with feverish libidos and all the rest of it. So Brian did his best, and they had a kind of love-hate relationship with Brian, but everybody knew that what Brian did was best for the Beatles, and they knew it.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I'm surprised to learn through the years, we all know about how the Beatles went through hell in 1966 in the Philippines, and also
Yes.
the John Lennon quote about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus and how afraid the Beatles were to come to America and all of that. But I later learned that by 1965, they were already weary of touring. But even in your book, you even say in 64, there were signs of that. So you want to explain the differences between 1964 and from what you observed on the West Coast in 65, if there were differences?
Yes. In 1964, it was all new. In 1964, when you went to a concert, and I went to every concert and sat in the front row and had cotton wool in my ears because the screaming was so hard, so loud. And in 1964, you could not hear the Beatles singing. The sound system was crap. They had 2 little, Mal and Neil Mal Evans, their road manager, you know this, of course, would drag on these little boxes and plug them in like it was for a stadium of 17,000 at the Hollywood Bowl, which was ridiculous. So the screaming overtook the sounds. And by the end of the first year, 64, John said to me that he was thinking he didn't like touring because he said something like, we're going to become a bunch of performing fleas in a circus, and I don't want this. And he would say, and this was true, he said, they haven't come to hear our music, they've come to see us, and I don't want that. I want the music. And of course, it took 2 years until they finally stopped touring in 66, as you know, and you talked about the horrible experience in the Philippines when they sort of had a hard time with Philippines president's wife, Lady Marcos. I forget, Emila Marcos. I forget her first name now. Anyway, and they had a hard time getting out of the country. So they were ready to stop. And they wanted to, and John said this, and the others said this, they wanted to concentrate on their music, pure and simple. And as you know, and the Beatle fans and Beatle experts know, this is what they did. They went into the studio with George Martin, and they turned out some of the greatest albums ever, thanks to George Martin, thanks to great orchestrations and stuff. I mean, all the violins coming in and all that sort of stuff. So they were ready to stop. And as you pointed out, the Philippines was like the final blow to say enough is enough.
Yeah, but even in your book in 64, there were signs of growing tired of it. And I even remember there was a quote from George Harrison at the end of the tour. He said, I'd like to come back to the States, but really see the States instead of just being holed up in their hotel rooms.
Well, that was a thing. You're absolutely right, Ken. I mean, we were fine. As a journalist, I could go out into the Strip. I could walk down Hollywood Boulevard. I could do anything. But the Beatles were trapped, and they never saw, as you pointed out, at the end of the. I mean, not Derek. John said, we haven't seen America, and it was true. Whether it was in Denver, wherever they were prisoners in their hotels, and that was pretty awful, really. So what are you going to do? And they never saw Vegas. They never saw any of the joys. The only time they got a break was when it was Brian's birthday, and they went off to this ranch owned by Reed Pigman, who was the guy that owned the Electrojet company that they we all traveled on. And so this is the only time they kind of broke loose and went on doom buggies and horseback riding. Otherwise, they were enslaved in their own hotel rooms, going from airport to convention center, airport, convention center, concert, back to airport, back to the next stop. I mean, it was crazy. And look at the timetable. It went on forever. I mean, I want to tell you that the Beatles, if I would say to Paul, where are we going next? He wouldn't know until the captain said, we'll be coming to Toronto. Oh, thanks. That's where we're going. They didn't have a clue. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting what you said about the ranch that you were talking about that they stayed at.
Yeah.
Because the guy that owned the plane company, he had
Reed Pigman, yeah.
Yeah. He had actually flown the plane and took the Beatles to the ranch in a small plane, and that's a story to itself.
Oh, well, the point was they could have gone by road, but it was tricky. We were in, let's see, I think we were in Dallas or, no, we landed at Walnut Ridge, Arkansas. And we, and then they got a plane. I forget where we were before. Anyway, they got this little tiny plane, which Reed Pigman flew them to his ranch, because the road to the ranch was a long and winding road and rather dangerous. So, and I remember George said there were the Beatles and Brian and Kurt Gunther, the photographer who went along with them.
Right.
And there was Reed Pigman in his little plane with and all of a sudden he was flying them into this little unmarked landing strip, and George was absolutely terrified because they said it was raining, and poor Pigman took out his handkerchief and ended up wiping the inside of the plane window with his hanky. I mean, what a way to go! And the Beatles were terrified on that flight, but when they landed, they were treated nicely. They had freedom that they'd never had for the last 4 weeks or 3 weeks, and they enjoyed themselves enormously. And then they came back and carried on again. So that was a welcome break for them at the Reed Pigman Ranch. And they could have died in the plane crash. I mean, George said he was very scared. Anyway, that was it.
Yeah, you even said that near the ranch there was total darkness. So how do you land the plane?
Well, that's the point. I mean, Reed Pigman was an experienced flyer, but when there are no lights on the runway, Pigman had done it 50 times, maybe in daylight, but to land on a dark runway because it was a private runway and they didn't have the normal airport lights. So Pigman knew where he was going, but the Beatles thought, what the hell? We're flying into a dark tunnel. That's what it was like for them, according to George. But they landed and they made it and they had a good time. And then they flew back and then picked up the tour.
And Kurt Gunther put out a book with photos of the Beatles' time at the ranch.
Oh, yeah. Kurt Gunther was a brilliant photographer who hassled the Beatles so well, got away with it. He said, his line used to say, he just said to Brian, we were sitting down, Kurt Gunther was of German extraction. He said, I got to make a picture, Brian. I got to make a picture. That was his whole thing. That was a funny line. And Brian said, okay, then come with us on this trip. So Kurt went with them he's the only photographer that went with them. And I don't know if you have seen Kurt's book, which is a terrific book.
Right. And also the sad thing is about Reed Pigman was that a year or so later, he was flying a transport jet and the jet crashed and he died and most of the passengers died.
There you go. I mean, and this was not a small plane. This was a big plane when Pigman died. So, the hand of God was with Brian and the Beatles on that occasion.
Yeah. Okay. Describe, if you will. I know you said that John was the one, I don't know if you got along with the most, but you found the most fascinating of the four of them?
Yes, I think so, because John was, as everybody who knows the Beatles, John was the most provocative. John liked to needle you. I mean, if he said, what's your name? My name's Ken. Are you Ken the man, Ken the man? He would try and poke a little bit of fun at you to get a bit of a rise out of you if you did that. And this is how he proceeded. He liked to provoke, and he also had a wonderful sense of humor. I mean, what was the line? Oh gosh, I wish I could remember the great line but that he said something about. I mean, he was a punster. He played on words, and even back then, Ken, he brought out a book called, I think, A Spaniard in the Works, right, which is a play on the English expression, a spanner in the works. He wrote these humorous, illustrated books that were brilliant, were funny, and he had them with us. And I wish I'd had the sense to have bought a book and said, hey, John, sign this, because 50 years from now, it will really be an antique worthwhile. But one didn't do that. So, yeah, so that was John, a provocateur. I mean, a little bit, sort of. He had a bit of something on his shoulder. I mean, he liked to needle you. And Paul was always. I mean, Paul's the way he was today. He was a good guy. He's I always used to say, and some people know this. He was in the old Irish expression. It really isn't an Irish expression. Those who hear the word will know. Paul was a gigantic schmoozer. He knew how to butter you up. He used to come down the runway, the aisle and say, do you want a gin and tonic, Ivor? Yeah, bring me a gin and tonic, but a little bit more lemon in it. Okay, fine. So Paul was like that. George, who I had to get along with best, most importantly, was a bit taciturn. George knew he called himself a third-class Beatle. He did. I mean, I think it comes across very well in the Ken Womack book, which I think you're familiar with. Right. Ken Womack wrote about Mal Evans, the road manager, and in a way, George was a second-class Beatle because he never got many songs, and he got Paul and John were the ones that commanded the stage, and George was a little bit resentful of that, but he knew he knew his role, and Ringo was Ringo. And Ringo played the drums, and Ringo sang a few songs, but it was all about that. So George was not the greatest guy to write a column for because he didn't really express himself as passionately as he did much later in life. And as soon as he left the Beatles, I think, and you're an expert. Let me throw the question at you. Do you think when George, it was like being freed from slavery? Maybe I'm a bit overdoing it because at this time of the year, but that George was freed from slavery to be his own man, be his own songwriter, be his own performer, and later in life he was much better. Would you concur?
Well, most people are somewhat complicated. And I think that George, you got to wonder how psychologically he was affected by being in the Beatles and always being second string to John and Paul.
Yes.
Um, he did, he was quoted once as saying, my first biggest break was being in the Beatles. My second biggest break was leaving the Beatles.
Yes.
So one of the things that I really loved, the story in your book, and it's perfect that we bring this up now, was the last time that you saw George, which
Yes.
was at Derek Taylor's funeral.
Yes.
And George said to you that Derek was very important to him because he tried to give him confidence in himself because George wasn't sure if he could make it on his own as a solo artist. So on the one hand, here's George with all this talent, and it's maturing at a rapid rate, certainly by, towards the end of the Beatles. So many great songs he's written. He puts out All Things Must Pass. He's loved by the public. And yet at the same time, I'm sure he was still insecure
Yes.
because, so many people always think of him as a Beatle first. And in the pecking order of the Beatles, is John and Paul is always first. And George would call himself, like you said, third class or the economy class Beatle
That's right. The
with
economy.
with Ringo. So on the one hand, it gave him the opportunity, it gave him the freedom to go make albums on his own. And I think that he blossomed even more as a songwriter and as a musician. And I'm really grateful. It's one of the benefits of the Beatles breaking up was the fact that we got to hear so much more out of George and Ringo than
Yeah.
you would have on Beatle albums where George got two songs in most cases and Ringo was lucky to have one. So, there's good and bad that comes with the Beatle breakup, but we got so much more music from them as solo artists than we would have had if they just stayed together.
Yes, it's. I mean, I like the way you put it: the good things and the bad thing, the worst thing and the worst thing. But you were absolutely right because Derek bonded best with George. Derek, after the Beatles broke up, joined George. I mean, used to see George and Derek touring America,
Mm.
and the complete circle, as you pointed out, was at the funeral for Derek. George was the only one there. Now, why did only George come? Because probably Joan Taylor said, if we get all the Beatles to show up, it's going to be a circus. And as it was not a circus. It was a very private event at the house and then at the church and then for the, all the tributes to George and, tributes to Derek.
Mm.
And I knew that Derek, I was quite close to Derek. I knew that Derek loved George better than the other boys. I mean, I know this sounds kind of crazy because he traveled with him. And whenever George came over to America, Derek would call me and say, hey, do you want to come and talk to George? George is doing it on his own. And George did it on his own. And he did it so well, as you pointed out, for the reasons you pointed out, which are perfect.
Yeah. Also, at that moment when you saw George at Derek's funeral, he was reminded of you ghostwriting for him. And he said to you that I couldn't write my way out of a paper bag, and I still
Yes.
can't.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for journalists to ghostwrite columns for famous people. I mean, I'd probably do it still today. I don't know. But George, I mean, he didn't have the ability, but Brian said to me, no, Derek said to me that Brian said, Ivor, you have to write his column because it will give George something to do on the tour, which is kind of funny because Brian knew that he was, thought third string of the Beatles, and he wanted to give him something to do on the tour, which in reflection sounds ridiculous. But this is, so why don't we give him a column, Derek? And they said Derek signed up George for me to do the column on the Daily Express, and that was it. So, and I must tell you, I don't know if I mentioned, I didn't mention this. Ken, but for the first few weeks, I couldn't get anything out of George because of the deadline. I mean, George went to bed at 2, woke up at 11, 12 o'clock. And if I was to do the column about what happened the day before, I had to get my story in before noon and the deadline. So George didn't give me much. And then I confess that I made the column up for the first 2 columns until George confronted me and said, I just spoke to my mother in London and she says my column is shite. I said, well, yeah, it probably is. But, you know, you've got to sit down. You've got to talk to me. You've got to tell me something that's going on in your skull. And after that, we did sit down. He did give me time and the column improved, I think, according to his mother.
I also think the Beatles are very conscious of trying to give each member of the group attention in the public eye. Witness Ringo getting so much attention early on and being, you know, in the Beatles movies, he was the star in some ways,
Yes.
especially in Help. So this would help to give George a bit more attention in your newspaper by doing something like that. You mentioned Dave Hull in your book, and I interviewed him on the podcast show Things We Said Today with Steve Marinucci when he had his book come out. Dave passed away several years ago.
I know. He lived in Palm Springs, I think, didn't he? Yeah.
Yeah. And he told me that he would get phone calls from George Harrison's mother with news.
Yes.
What's going on with the Beatles.
Yes.
Dave could report that on the radio station that he was on, KRLA, which is the same station that had Casey Kasem.
That's right.
Was that the same one with Bob Eubanks? I forgot.
It was. It was in Pasadena at the time, Pasadena, California. KRLA. I mean, they were a rock giant record company. I mean, radio station in Southern California. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Right. So, but it just goes to show you that here's George's mother, giving this DJ this news, whatever she could share, and that in turn would help to give George's name a little bit more of a push.
Yeah. And the other story. Sorry to interrupt, because I just remind, after the Beatles tour, years later, I got friendly with George's sister Louise, who's no longer with us. And Louise told me stories that I couldn't believe. She said before the Beatles came over, she got a call from Brian Epstein's office, and then Brian Epstein, and he said, Louise, you live in America. She lived in the Midwest, in the Chicago area in Illinois. She said, I'm going to send you some records. Would you take them around to the radio stations in your neighborhood and give them to the disc jockeys? So here was this rock and roll famous group, the Beatles, getting the sister for no pay whatsoever to take vinyl around to the rock and roll stations. And thought of today, that's Mickey Mouse stuff, isn't it?
Right.
You're going to get a relative to take it. And Louise was so passionate about her brother's success that she did it, and she got it to some good people. So the way they did it then, it was Mickey Mouse time.
Right.
You want to be famous there, Ken? Get your sister, your brother to take your record around. I mean, come on.
That's all you need.
That's all you need.
Radio stations, and it'll explode just like that.
Yeah.
But she really did try.
Oh, she did. I mean, even to her dying day, and I met her a few times at a friend of mine's house who stayed with her in Rancho Santa Fe in California. She was passionate. I saw her at conventions. She really tried to get the word out across before the Beatles came. And she was very successful in that. She did it with heart and passion, but no money.
And unfortunately, the record companies that put out Beatles records in '63, VJ and Swan, they weren't successful, even though they got some airplay, not a lot, not enough to put them anywhere in the Hot 100 in America. So,
well, it was. I mean, don't you agree that the way they did it in the early days, even with Capitol Records, was Bush League promotion? Because they didn't know. I mean, they weren't sophisticated the way they are today, are they? I mean, nothing. So it was amateur hour.
Right. Well, Capitol turned them down initially, and it was only because of the buildup going on.
Yeah.
In the UK, especially, and the pandemonium that broke, that they felt they had to do something. And one thing led to another, and it was a miracle that everything fell into place the way it did.
Yes.
So that's part of what makes 1964 so special in the
Yes.
United States. Yeah. You want to talk about the story you have in here, which a lot of Beatle fans know about Charles Finley and how he got the Beatles to do
Yeah.
a concert?
Well, the interesting thing was that, I mean, when you look at the Beatles' timetable and where they went, it was done helter skelter. I mean, it was all over the bloody place. We start in Seattle, we go to Canada, we come back to New York. Not well organized. I mean, it was just all over the place. And in the middle of the tour, Brian got a call from Charles Finley, who was the owner of the baseball team in Kansas City. I forget what they were called. I'm not into baseball, the Kansas City, whatever.
Athletics.
Athletics, thank you. And so he said he wanted to have the Beatles perform in Kansas City, but it wasn't on their timetable. So Brian uh, sort of discussed it with him, and I think he got him up to like $125,000 because I think it was $50,000 normally at the even at the Hollywood Bowl. $125,000, and Finley said yes. And then he went in to see the Beatles and said, we're going to squeeze in another concert. And the Beatles said, like, and they're going to pay us $125,000. And actually, the Beatles couldn't care less about what they were going to get. I know this sounds ridiculous in today's world. And they said, okay, Brian, if you want to do it, we'll do it. So then so we landed in Kansas City, and I forget what the date was. Um, and and um, and what was funny was that Finley insisted on introducing the Beatles, and I think he put on a stupid wig, a Beatle wig, and he looked awful. But the interesting thing was, every time they performed in America, they did their set. They never deviated. But in Kansas City, they opened with the song Kansas City, and that was the only deviation of their play list. And they kind of enjoyed it, and Finley got his way, and he ended up paying $125,000 or wherever, and the Beatles went on their merry way. So, to squeeze these things in, how often? And let me ask you this, because you are an expert on the business. If Paul McCartney goes to Australia, or the Rolling Stones travel the world, they have a set. If they're going to go to here, they're going to go to there, they're going to do this. It's meticulously planned. Have you ever heard of them squeezing in an extra city or an extra concert in after that has happened? Would that happen today?
Well, there are times when there are initial dates that are set, and then
Yeah,
later on they add more dates to see if they can fit it in. And these days, whenever someone like Paul tours, he likes to have a few days off in between to rest his
yeah,
voice. So I think it all depends upon him and whether or not his voice can handle fitting a show in between. If you got 3 days off, well, maybe you can fit one more in there.
yes,
So he might be thinking also about the extra money and the band members making more money too.
yeah.
And so there's a lot to consider there. But
Do you think? Sorry, I mean, I love that line you used about Paul looking for the extra money, and it's true the band members would get a bit more, but I think at this stage of his career, although maybe I shouldn't say this, that Paul doesn't need the extra money, does
no,
he?
no, not at all. But it's also the thought of, I do believe that Paul is very much aware of there are fans around the world still to this day who have never seen him live. There are young fans popping up, God bless them, who become Beatle fans, or they know him for some of his solo music and they've never seen him live. And
Yes,
just for the chance to see him once, throw an extra date in there, or at a venue that is not on the agenda, or that he's never played before.
yes,
For example, he played Australia, um, what was it, last year? And it was the first time in a long time, like since 1993 or something like that. So he knows when there are people in different countries that
yes,
haven't seen him and for a long time, or places he hasn't played. So I think he cares about that. At the same time, he almost always plays in the US because the demand is always going to be strong there.
yes,
And I'm sure there are times like he played St. Louis for the first time in many years recently. he keeps track of these things, or somebody tells him you haven't been in this major city for a long time. So I think he cares a lot about that.
Yes, and so he will work to squeeze somewhere in. Yeah, I mean, because he's aware of his legend, and he's aware of. I mean, he is more aware than any of them. I think Ringo now does his all-star band. But you know, the interesting thing is, I'm sure you've seen Ringo, haven't you? You've seen Ringo
On every
perform.
tour, on every tour.
Okay, on every tour. So my evaluation, and tell me how this fits in with your evaluation there, Ken. Ringo knows his limitations. Ringo knows people have come to see him, really, and the other all-star band are great musicians and great performers. And Ringo, the last time I saw him, and I can't remember if this also applied to when you saw him, he leaves the stage for a little while, and takes a break, and then comes back and lets the younger members of his all-star band perform.
Uh-huh.
Paul doesn't do that. Paul is on stage for 3 hours and 15 minutes nonstop.
Well, I think that there's something else to say about Ringo's tours because, yes, he knows his limitations. He's not going to do a 2-hour show where he's singing every single song. I don't think his
Right.
voice could probably handle that
Yeah.
much. Maybe an hour to an hour and a half.
Yes.
But I also think that he genuinely enjoys drumming behind all the other musicians because he gets to play their songs. It's a break from what he normally does, even though he's had the same musicians in the All-Stars for quite a while.
Yeah.
But for the first since 1989, we're talking 20 to 30 years or so, 30 plus. His band members changed at every single tour, and that added a whole new dimension. New songs brought into the set list, and he drums behind those songs. He
Yeah.
loves just drumming. He doesn't always have to be up front singing.
Yes.
And it's not always easy to drum and sing at the same time. So I think he really does enjoy working with the musicians that he's been with, and they all get to play their biggest hits. And that's the only way, well, in most cases, you're ever going to see Ringo drum behind other musicians playing their songs.
Yes. Well, that's quite, in a way, humbling in a way, and the fact that he's willing to do that. He's willing to step into the background and even leave the stage for a while, although they want him to come back. So it's interesting when you see the Paul show, and as you said, you see the Ringo show, and there is a big difference because because I always like to ask this question, and I know you know the answer, I'm sure you do, because on that first American tour in '64, how long do you think the Beatles performed their set for?
It was under 30 minutes, probably 20
Correct.
minutes.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
And what was funny was, Ken, that they loved to try and break their record. It was under 30 minutes, and they said, "Oh, we got off. It was 26 minutes and 30 seconds. We did it because there was very little conversation between songs." I mean, I mean, all John would say, and now we're going to play the theme music from our latest movie, A Hard Day's Night, and that was it. They didn't chitter chatter. But I haven't been to that many rock concerts. Do the rock stars chitter chatter? I mean, you go to a lot of shows. Do they have, a lot of conversation, non-music stuff in between each song?
Some of them do, some of them hardly say a word.
Yeah.
It depends on who the person was. I remember seeing Leon Russell many
Huh?
years ago, and he barely said a word in between songs. It
Yeah.
was bang, 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 one song after another. And then there are people who love to gab.
Yeah, but
You know?
Bob Dylan doesn't, does he?
I've only seen Dylan twice. He didn't
Yeah.
really talk much at all in the concert. No. And then you've got more of the storytellers type shows. I saw, God bless him, Denny Lane,
Yeah.
a year ago where it was just him and an acoustic guitar, and he told stories about the songs. So a good half of the show was just him talking. It
Wow.
depends upon what the approach is each time. Um, Most musicians have it already, um, it's already planned out what they're going to say. Like Paul, at certain points in the show, he'll tell certain stories and repeat the same stories, and it's
Sure.
always in front of specific songs. It's all rehearsed, it's all laid out. And at least he is talking to the audience when he
Yes.
does that. And a lot of artists are just like that.
Yeah, and Paul also one of the, I mean, talk about production. Paul does. I mean, I think he still does the fireworks for Live and Let Die,
Sure does.
which is terrific. And he never leaves the stage. And I must admit, it's pretty phenomenal that he does it for so long. I mean, last time I clocked it as 3 hours and 15 minutes non-stop.
Hmm.
I mean, does Bruce do that? Do any of them do 3 hour shows?
Well, Bruce is known for doing longer shows than that.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
don't, as someone, I only saw Bruce once, but I don't know what his shows are today. If they're, I'm sure they're at least 3 hours,
Yes. Yes.
but I don't know if they're as long as they used to be.
Yeah.
There's only very few people that can do that and pull that off, and Paul's been one of them. So
Well, the interesting thing, we're talking about length of shows, and you were spot on with when in 64, 26 minutes was about maximum.
yeah,
And I don't know, but what we had on the plane, and as you know, we had the warm-up acts for the Beatles. We had Jackie DeShannon, we had the Righteous Brothers, and nobody came to see them, and they got PO'd. I remember on the first tour, the Righteous Brothers were so upset that as they were performing, the helicopter came in and drowned them out. That they asked Brian if they could leave, and Brian said, Brian said yes, and
right.
I think he brought in Clarence Frogman Henry to fill in '64. But you can understand that. I'm going to a Beatle concert. A young lady tells her father, "I'm going to see Jackie DeShannon and the Righteous Brothers." No, I'm going to see the Beatles, and that was the whole point. The Beatles were the star attraction, and who cared about the opening acts? And I can't even remember if there are. I don't think there are opening acts. I haven't been to a rock show for some time. Are there opening acts for stars anymore?
Once in a while. I
Yeah.
mean, it hasn't happened for Paul in something like 10 years. Uh, it depends. If you're an iconic artist
Yes,
like Paul, you don't need to have an opening act.
that's right.
You
Yes.
know, he usually has this special 20 to 30-minute mix that's played of his music, especially for his concerts, and he opens with that and then comes on stage for that.
Yeah.
Everybody's different. It all depends upon who's promoting the tour and whether or not they want to promote a new artist. Um, if a certain veteran artist can't perform as long as they used to,
Yes.
they want to make the concert stretch a lot. You got a lot of double bills of big artists like Rod Stewart and Cyndi Lauper, teamed up together for years.
Yes.
Chicago and Earth, Wind and Fire teamed up together. There's a lot of, veteran acts that do that because that way they can preserve their voices. Maybe they can't last as long as they once did.
Yes.
And at the same time, some of these acts have done complete shows, but it does help once in a while to take a break and share the stage with another artist.
Yes.
So,
Well,
yeah,
I mean, just to interrupt you, last week, and I never went. Paul was at the Hollywood Bowl,
right.
and it was a tribute. You probably know because you keep your finger on the pulse to do a tribute to a country and western star, and he shared the billing with like 6 other people. I didn't go to that Hollywood Bowl concert, but Paul was the star attraction, and people went to see Paul. But he probably, and I don't want to talk out of the facts I don't know, that he probably didn't perform for more than half an hour. Maybe he did. And maybe he'll call you up and say, yes, I performed for an hour. And that guy was wrong. But anyway,
No, you're talking about Jimmy Buffett, who just
yes, that's it. Jimmy Buffett. That was a tribute to Buffett. Yeah.
and Paul just performed "Let It Be," and that was it, just the one song.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So-
Okay, then you got your finger on the pulse there. Yeah. So he
And
did
he
one
actually,
song. Yeah.
yeah, but he had the Eagles. The Eagles performed, in
Yes.
concert, and the Eagles backed up Paul. So
Uh,
it wasn't all, opening acts that are new artists. Jack
yes.
Brown was there. I think Sheryl Crow was there.
Yes.
So yeah, but it was a fitting tribute to Jimmy, and it's only in recent years that I was even aware that Paul had become good friends with Jimmy the last few
Yeah.
years of his life. So yeah.
Yeah, that's that. I'm glad you told me that. Actually, you saved me $600 for a ticket now that you told me that. So thank you.
Well, you might have enjoyed the whole thing. I mean, there's a
Yeah, I'm
lot
sure.
of great
Look,
content.
I was thinking of going. It's only an hour and a quarter for me. And then I started, I think for a variety of reasons, I didn't go. And I thought I'd love to go to see Paul again, but I knew somehow instinctively that I wouldn't get all of Paul. I got what you just told me, and maybe I'd have been disappointed, although I'm sure the people at the Hollywood Bowl were not disappointed, were they?
Probably not. And you can always watch Paul's performance on YouTube of
There
later.
you go. Yeah. Yeah.
But getting back to Charles Finley, the one thing
Yeah.
that I didn't know about that concert was that fans of the baseball team looked at it as being a way of promoting the team. So they kind of boycotted like any Charles Finley event
Yes.
time. That's what you said in your book.
Yeah, yeah, because Finley was a real character in the days, but and the Beatles never knew anything about baseball. But Finley, you're absolutely right. Finley thought that this would be good for the baseball world, although in today's world, I don't know whether that would be a big selling point. I'm going to put the Beatles on at the stadium where my baseball team plays, and that's going to bring people to the baseball games because the Beatles and baseball didn't quite go together. So I don't know. Would baseball fans have loved the Beatles? Probably. And they got a pretty good crowd. I can't remember what the crowd was in Kansas City, but certainly, I mean, obviously Finley was a promoter. Finley was a showman. Finley, and that's what you have to do with sports. And whether more people went to the games, the baseball games, I don't know, but it was certainly a nice way for $125,000 to promote baseball.
Hmm. All right. Here's something that I wasn't aware of until I read it in your book. September 18th of 64, the Beatles were in Dallas, and John wanted to visit the Texas School Bank Depository where
Right.
President Kennedy was assassinated. And John told Art Schreiber,
Yes.
who covered the Beatles for Westinghouse and their radio stations, that he was genuinely outraged by America's passion for guns and the ongoing reports of violence that he saw on television. It's really ironic when you think about it. Yeah, and they actually didn't visit.
He didn't. Now that you bring that up, the line "everything changes, but nothing changes"
Hmm,
applies to today, so horribly so.
right.
But you're right. But Brian was very nervous about controversy and the Beatles, and Brian said to John, who John was I mean, Paul claims he was very politically aware, and maybe he was, but John was the one who was the political mind, even then. And I know Art Schreiber very well, and Art told me, and I saw it happening, that because Art Schreiber was a political correspondent who found himself thrown into the Beatles pond and wondered why. And Art Schreiber would be, once the Beatles knew he'd been covering conventions, and John particularly was interested in politics even back then, he would sit down with Art and he would show Art pictures on the front page of the local paper of black marches and civil rights marches, and ask Art what was going on. So John was the one who was most politically aware, and I think Paul was second in command, and the other two weren't that passionate about politics, American politics. And John was learning. John became the sponge learning about politics and civil rights from Art Schreiber, who knew everything, and he covered Martin Luther King and all those riots and all those stories. Anyway, so getting back to your original question, which I forget what it was because I talked too long. Go ahead.
Is that the Beatles didn't visit the depository? So that
Yes, yes. So
Brian.
yeah. So because Brian, sorry, go ahead.
No. I'm clearing my throat.
Okay. So Brian thought that if John showed up at the textbook depository site, it would cause consternation, because don't forget, it was less than 1 year since Kennedy had been shot.
Right.
In Dallas in November 22nd, 1962, I think. Is it 62? Yeah, no, 63. Sorry, 63, because they were there in 64. Less than 1 year had they had Kennedy been shot. So Brian thought if the Beatles showed up, it would be negative publicity. It would rub salt into the still healing wounds of America. And he said to John, "No, don't go." And John never went.
Okay. Just interesting to learn that in your book.
Yeah.
Also, you said that John was angry about all the you call them rubbish souvenirs
Yeah.
were sold at their concerts. He looked at them as being quick, get rich quick scheme.
Yes.
And you actually bought a Beatles wig,
I did.
and John threw it out the hotel window.
Yes, I mean, I bought a wig. I mean, I wish I'd kept that wig, but and the reason why I didn't keep that wig was, first of all, it was pretty awful, and I think I paid $1 for it, if that, maybe even 50 cents. And I showed it to John, and he went to the hotel window and he just threw it out. And I always say that I then said to John, "You owe me 50 cents, John." I mean, he never ever paid me back. And even when I tried to get the money back from Yoko, she ignored me. So that, I mean, that 50 cents is probably $10 today. Anyway, so there you go. He didn't like the whole manipulation of the merchandising. And the merchandising of the Beatles back then was very, very modest. I mean, you could buy the stuff there, but it wasn't the way it is today. I mean, you go to a Paul or Ringo concert, and the first thing that hits you in the eye is all the stuff you can buy, particularly Paul's stuff. I mean, my God, and how expensive it is by today's, in today's market. So, but there it is. People like souvenirs, don't they?
Especially t-shirts, which I go for, and hoodies and stuff. That's really.
But can you wear all the t-shirts you've collected? Can you where do you keep your I mean, I've got a ton of t-shirts. Where how often do you wear them? Are you wearing a Beatle t-shirt now?
I'm wearing a Paul shirt right now.
Oh, okay. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's a good one. Good.
Most of my podcast shows, I'm wearing a Beatles shirt or a solo shirt most of the time, or a shirt for a radio station. So
there it is. Yeah.
I do. But I do have clothes from when I was a teenager that I'm not going to get rid of.
Yes. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's kind of like hopefully it'll motivate me to lose some more weight so I can still fit in those shirts.
Well, that's one way of doing it, and other than eating too much. But the interesting thing is, in today's world of the internet, you do have to be a shameless huckster. I mean, if you've got a book coming out, you have to get out there. It's no good. I mean, you can get interviews in the major newspapers, but the way to do it is to go online and use the internet to promote whatever you're doing, whether it's a new book, a new film, and it's a whole new, not really new world, but it's a whole new approach to marketing, isn't it?
Yeah, but it also means that a lot of major publishers for books are not going to spend the money in promoting it, and you've got to do it yourself.
Exactly. And don't even go there, because that is a wound I carry in my. I mean, I have, besides my Beatle book, I have a true life murder book coming out in May about a friend of mine who turned out to be a killer, and the publishing company, I have a large publishing company who said to me several months ago, "Are you going to hire a PR person to promote your book?" I mean, I thought, but isn't that what you're supposed to do? Isn't that where you get all, I don't want to get on my high horse here. Isn't that why you're taking all the bloody royalties? You're publishing my book and you're telling me to do the marketing. Well, we do a certain limited thing, but like everything else, and stop me if I go on too long. It's my favorite rant. I mean, in the old days, when you wrote a book, you get the publishing company to put you on the road, send you out on the road and promote the book. Now they do zilch.
Right.
They do zilch and they expect you to do your own. So it's a whole new world.
That's why there are more and more self-published books today.
Yeah. And because self-publishing, I know you're not into publishing. This is my favorite rant. When you do self-publishing books, you are in the driver's seat. You're paying for the books and you're paying a lot less. and I know this isn't what you want to talk about, but you're going to give me another 10 seconds.
All right.
And in the old days, they did it for you. In the new days, you do it for yourself. But at least, exactly as you said, more self-published books, because the top writers, some of the top writers say, we are in charge of it. We can control it, leaving it to a gigantic publisher. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say. And sorry about the rant.
That's quite all right. But you got to do the research to know where to go to publicize it. And that's a lot of work right there.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Something else that I picked up from your book. This is not a big surprise to me, but there's one part of it that is. The John and Ringo in particular were very uncomfortable dealing with crippled kids
Yes.
who came to their shows, and some of them wanted to meet them backstage. And we've all heard the stories. John, I think in particular, would complain that these kids would expect, or their parents would expect them to perform miracles like they were God, like they were going to cure them.
Yeah.
But the word cripple itself
Yes.
became, you called it their Mayday signal to Neil and to Mal to gently eject someone who was no longer welcome in their dressing room, whether they were disabled or otherwise.
Yes.
Found that interesting.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing was John particularly was the most cynical of all Beatles. And John hated the idea of the having, I mean, I mean, now you'd call them handicapped, or there's another even new word that you use for handicapped children, disabled or whatever. And for some reason, John hated the idea that they would bring the handicapped kids in their wheelchairs into the front. And John said, what am I supposed to do? Go out there and lay hands on them like Jesus and heal them? Heal. I mean, that kind of thing. And that appalled John. And as I say, he called them cripples, and then he called them cripples with a double innuendo that Mal and Neil knew what that meant. And John just, I mean, what would happen was and I think I write about it, was in our hotel room, John would strut around with his finger on his moustache. He didn't have a moustache, over his lip, and do a Hail Hitler thing, because then he'd go to the window with the curtain open, and then all the girls outside would scream, and he'd draw the curtains and they would stop. And he did my, De Fura thing, which was kind of, I mean, a lot of people said, is that anti-Semitic? I said, no, it wasn't anti-Semitic. It was just John's cynical sense of humor. He thought, why are people treating us like gods? And I don't like it. And that was what it was all about. Same with the handicapped kids, or the crippled kids, as he called them, in the front row. We're not going to heal the kids. Don't make me do this, sort of thing.
But the fact that they use that word.
Yes. But don't forget, I mean, Ken, as time goes by, words fall out of favor. I mean, you no longer call somebody who's handicapped crippled. You don't call him a cripple. Right. And now there's even another word. It's hard to keep up. So all of a sudden, like 20 years later, for handicapped kids, no, you don't call them handicapped. You call them disabled. You call them whatever. I mean, I have friends who are teachers, but they never say handicapped teachers anymore. They say the okay word. And that was what John was railing against, the idea that they were gods and that they could perform miracles. No, they couldn't. No, I can't, said John. Yeah, anyway, so that's the whole handicap thing.
Right. Now, somewhere in your book, I'm trying to remember where you said it, but I found it interesting that Paul kept with him a briefcase.
Yes.
With songs that he had written either by himself or with John, and he carried it with him everywhere. And so
that's right. It was a beat up old little satchel that you used, a briefcase that was really kind of beat up, but we knew that was where, because don't forget, they had to write so many songs. Brian was a taskmaster. Brian on the tour said, we need a Christmas album of 16 or 18 new songs. So you can't write them when you get home, because by the time you get home, it's too close to deadline. So we want you to write these songs on the road. So not only were they doing the concerts and the in and out and the press conferences and all that stuff, John and Paul were supposed to write new music. and I would see them writing music. And when they wrote a piece, they put it into this old suitcase, this little satchel, kind of beat up. And Neil would be in charge of making sure it went everywhere. That was like the precious possession and we knew that was where the songs were. We didn't realize at the time how many songs there were, but they wrote on the floor of the hotel room. They wrote in the plane. They wrote whenever they had time off, which wasn't much. And some of the great songs, I don't know which songs came out because my calendar is a little bit off. But they wrote some great stuff, and they came out with their 16-song album or whatever it was in late November.
Did you ever witness John and Paul write together?
Yes, I did. I mean, I would go. I mean, you've got to understand that the doors were not locked. The doors were always open, and if we were in the next room. I was in the next room, and I want to go to the mini bar and help myself to one of their drinks, which I did quite often. I would walk in there and then go to the bar and say hi, and they would be sitting on the floor writing their songs. And I knew they were writing songs because there were pieces of yellow legal pad thrown around. I mean, as I said, I always regret not picking them up and putting them in my pocket.
Yeah.
I could be a millionaire today, or nearly. And I knew that we were writing, so I would just help myself to a drink and see you later and leave. So they wrote there. They wrote on the plane, particularly. Whenever they could, and wherever they had time off. It's amazing when you think of it. They did it off the cuff. And I remember, sorry to go on to this, but I remember going to see Paul when he was married to Linda, and he was at the Beverly Hills Hotel in Hollywood years later. And he was there because his song "Live and Let Die" was up for an Oscar. It didn't win. I forget the year, maybe the 70s. What was it?
When you saw him, it was 74.
74, yes, yeah. So he was there at the Beverly Hills. I went to see him, say hello, and we just chatted and did a story about him being nominated for an Oscar. And, he said to me, and he played it for me on the piano in the hotel. And he said, and I'm sure many other songwriters may have said this, he said he played it for me. He said, I wrote this in 10 minutes. And they were so swift. I mean, he writes this song for a movie in 10 minutes, and he played it for me. I said, well, it sounds, it's good. And I'd seen the movie, so I knew the music. So this is the way they were, so lightning speed.
Yeah.
You don't sit around for 5 days with one song. Not for the Beatles. They wrote it. They were so incredibly fast.
Well, Denny Sywell said that about "Live and Let Die." He remembers Paul wrote it really quickly. But are there specific songs that you remember seeing John and Paul write together?
Well, to be honest with you, the answer is I don't remember exactly what they were writing, because they didn't say the name of this. They never sang it for me. They never sang it for anybody that I know. Maybe they sang it for Brian, or because Brian needed to know, do we have enough songs in the bag? The only, as I said, my story about seeing Paul do that and telling me he wrote it in 10 minutes. And then, of course, we have the stories about that Peter Asher says that Paul wrote a lot of songs I think it was in the attic where he was living in Wimpole Street, not Wimpole Street, wherever Paul Asher's parents lived, where Paul lived during the Jane Asher period. So it's amazing. And in your experience, and music, when you've interviewed people who've written great music, do they say we wrote this over a week, or did they say they wrote it in half an hour?
It depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
Some artists like to labor on a song over and over and over again. Some people, like Todd Rundgren.
Yes.
Todd Rundgren, first of all, he says the first song he ever wrote was "Hello, It's Me."
Yeah.
That's a very complicated song for a very young person to write, with complicated chords in there. I find it a little hard to believe. But he also said he wrote "I Saw the Light" in 10 minutes.
Wow.
And it's possible. Some songs come to you quickly. Some take a while to develop. There's so many instances. I mean, you can point to this. There's a lot that's out there, a lot of information when it comes to John, Paul, and George, about songs that they start at one moment, they go away from it for a while, then they revisit it, They remember they had written it and they wanted to develop it more. So every song is different. There are songs that were written very quickly in the Beatle years, especially they had to,
Yeah.
because like you said, there was a deadline. They had 2 albums to put out a year. And with that, because of the fact that very often they didn't want their singles to be on their albums, so they had to put out an album in most cases of 14 songs. And you're talking about 1964. If you're talking
Yeah.
about that year, the end of that year, you had Beatles for Sale, which had
Yeah.
14 songs on it, albeit 6 covers. But you also had I Feel Fine and She's a Woman, which wasn't on the album. So you actually had 16 songs coming out all at the end of the year. So they had to do that, and there was a lot of pressure. But you know, because of the fact that they had to stay together so much all the time on tour and, also in the studio and everything, and the fact that they got a little help from the cover versions, they were able to do that.
Yeah.
So it's pretty much a miracle how many songs were written pretty quickly.
Yeah, and also every time when I do interviews like I'm doing with you, I mean, if I say, you probably know this precisely, Ken, I would say, didn't they write at least 200 songs or more, the Beatles, John and
Well,
Paul, and
yeah, I would say over 200. I don't know if there's ever an exact accurate amount, but if you take a look at all the Lennon-McCartney songs that came out in the Beatles catalog, plus the songs they wrote for other people,
yes,
plus songs early on that they didn't release, you know. Yeah, I'd say there's over 200, but I don't know the exact amount.
yeah.
I don't know if anybody does.
Well, the other thing about songwriting, and I always thought, we all thought this was BS when Brian said, very early on, the Beatles are like Beethoven of today. I mean, we all said, yeah, yeah, come on, this is a bunch of, but in a way, I mean, if you're talking about the pop music, the rock music, the legendary songs, they probably more prolific than Beethoven.
Hmm. Well, apart from what they did just as a band and in that period in the
Yeah.
60s, you talk about prolific, you got to include all the solo music. I mean,
Yes.
Paul McCartney in his solo career has been one of the most prolific artists. And I
Yeah.
think if John was alive today and he continued to record,
Oh,
he still would be very prolific.
yeah.
Then you add all the stuff George Harrison's written, and Ringo has written and co-written a lot of songs now. So
Yes.
you put all that in perspective, it's an amazing catalog, and
Yeah.
it's massive now. I mean, just what they did in the 60s alone, you can easily look at as being the greatest catalog of all time. A lot of people do.
Yes.
So there are some people who think you could stop right there. But if you add this other catalog of the last, what is it, 54 years, um, it's a lot of music, a lot to say.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you another question because a lot of people ask me this question. I'd be interested to know your answer is. As you know, for 4 years, John Lennon fought deportation,
Mm.
and finally he won and he was allowed to stay. A lot of people say to me, do you think John would be alive today if he'd been deported? And I'm going to throw that question at you.
It's an impossible question to answer. But I think that if he stayed in England, it's my opinion, he probably would be alive today because
Yeah.
you don't have guns roaming freely the way that you do in the United States. Of course, you can always make the argument it was one deranged person who did this,
Yes.
and I probably would say yes, he would be alive, but nobody knows for sure.
Yeah.
You know, it,
Because that whole period was fascinating with Wiles, Wiles. I forget his first
Leon,
name.
Leon,
What?
yeah,
Leon doing an incredible job. And I love the story that Leon tells because I met his son a few years ago who said, when my father took John and Yoko on, he thought they were flamenco dancers. He didn't know who they were. And I thought that, I mean, that's such a great story. And it shows you that he didn't take them because they were famous. And I must tell you one other story that I have in my new book, which also gives me a bit of a kick. Last year, as I was writing my new book, I was writing a segment about Paul McCartney's, where does he live? What is he worth? Where does he own? And somebody told me that Paul McCartney was bought a house in Malibu. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I know a lot of people in Malibu. I used to live there. I called up my real estate friends, and none of them knew about it. And then about 6 months ago, I was meeting a friend at the Paradise Cove Cafe, which is on the beach in Malibu. And when I went down to have dinner, my friend introduced me to the owner, of the manager of the place, and he said, "Oh, you should have been." And it said to me, "I traveled with the Beatles." And the owner said, "It's a pity you weren't here last night because Paul and Linda were in for dinner." I said, "Oh, that's kind of interesting. That jibes with them buying a place." And so I said, "How is that? What, do they come in here very often?" And he said, "They come in here quite often. They can walk to here from their house." I said, "Their house? Where did they buy the house?" I'd heard they. He said, "Well, they bought a mobile home." He said, "I bought a mobile home for $5.5 million. Wow, what a mobile home. And it's true. So they now live in a $5.5 million home in Malibu. I'm not going to say exactly where, but the point is, oh yeah, so the punchline of this story is, so that we sit down with the waitress, and the waitress is a young woman of 26. I asked her how old she was, and I say, "Oh, did you know that Paul and Nancy were in last night?" And she says, "Well, I didn't know who they were until somebody told me." She said, "I thought he was just a nice old English gentleman with a white beard." And I thought, there it is. Paul McCartney, the richest rock star on the face of the earth, is a nice old English gentleman with a white beard. So there's hope for us old gentlemen with white beards.
And he could just walk the streets freely, you know?
Yes. Well, I mean, yes. I mean, he does. He did,
Yes.
particularly in COVID, didn't he?
Yeah, he walks the streets of New York once in a while.
But can you believe? I mean, it's great to be wealthy and famous, but can you believe if Paul goes into a restaurant, he's got to go in quietly. If he sits in the open area, people are going to come up, aren't they? And this is what happens. And that's one of the prices of fame. You lose your privacy. But Paul seems to be coping quite well with that, doesn't he?
Yeah. But it's kind of funny. They probably like the idea of people working with them that are not major fans of theirs.
Yes.
You know, they don't want people drooling over them or
Yeah.
treating them like they're God. And in a way, it was probably appealing that someone like you was there because you weren't too familiar with what they had done at that point or
Yes.
what the whole
Yes.
video was, you know.
Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
make sure there's two stories here that you bring up in your book that are very important. You probably talked about it many times, but I got to bring it up. First of all, when the Beatles met Elvis Presley.
Yes.
Now, just to remind myself, I went back to the Beatles anthology, and there's a scene in there where Paul and George and Ringo are talking about it. And we've all wondered through the years, did they ever jam together? And George said he didn't. And then Paul had said he remembered John jammed with Elvis.
Yes.
So you actually say specifically in your book, there are four
Yes.
songs there that they jammed on. I need to know who jammed. Was it John, Paul, and George? Because there were no drums there. So I guess
No, no, there were no drums. So what happened was, um, John was the one that wanted to meet Elvis the most. It didn't happen in 1964 because they were doing their thing and there wasn't time, and Elvis was making his 10th movie of the year. And then the next year, Brian Epstein finally got them together with the Beatles at Elvis's house. Now, I should preface this with, they were all keen to meet Elvis, but when they got to the house, we all arrived at the same time,
mm,
and Elvis was kind of cool. And even though, you mentioned when they did the what was it again? Now they did years later. They did a look back, and they all,
anthology.
yeah, sorry, the anthology. Oh, Paul says what a wonderful day it was, and they all say, "Oh, it was fantastic. It was smooth. It was the greatest thing that we ever happened." Not so, not so, because I was there and I saw that they were very awkward. and nobody introduced Elvis to the Beatles when they walked in. Elvis was watching TV on a giant 15-inch screen, 16-inch screen that was giant at the time. And it took about 15 minutes. I mean, nobody said, meet John, Elvis, Paul, Elvis. Nobody did that. So we sat around for 15 minutes. Elvis looked changing the channels with a clicker, which England never had clickers. And finally, Elvis said, and with a sense of humor, if you come here to jam, otherwise I'm going to bed. And that kind of broke the ice. So they brought in guitars, but they didn't have any drums, and he didn't have any drumsticks. And I think Mal had those little, what do they call them for guitar things? I'm so bad on music. Little clips that they, whatever they are, and he gave them to, and Ringo was in the other room. Ringo was playing pool with Parker and with Brian. And then they started jamming, but they didn't play any Beatle music because Elvis took over. And they played for about 15 minutes, and it was quite good, but they never played a single Beatles song. They played, and I remember that vividly because Elvis was in charge, and the Beatles went along with it. And as I say, and Ringo was not there because they didn't have drumsticks. But then he came back later on, just towards the end, and somebody gave him some a cymbal thing, what they call it, a castanet type thing, and he banged on that. They didn't have drumsticks. So that was it. And then they said they would meet again, but they never did. And then the bottom line is, years later, I realized the reason that Elvis gave them such a cool welcome was because, number one, they had knocked him off the perch as the king of rock and roll with their music. They were English. Elvis made 3 movies or 4 movies a year. All of them cookie cutter movies. The Beatles made one record, one movie, Hard Day's Night. It was a smash hit. And the Beatles 5 days earlier had sold out Shea Stadium and done a live concert, and Elvis had not done live concerts. So all those things added up to some resentment from Elvis. And so they finally finished, and they left, and they said they would get together again, but they didn't. And then years later, you may remember when Elvis went along with a gift for Richard Nixon, he pulled out a pistol, an old antique pistol in the White House, and gave it to Nixon. And then he badmouthed the Beatles. And then he said something like, I can bring in your young voters. Okay. He said, but those Beatles, he said, they go to America, they earn $1 million, they go back to England, and they badmouth America. For some reason, Elvis wanted to badmouth the Beatles, and he did. And of course, it wasn't true. When the Beatles heard that Elvis, particularly Ringo, heard that Elvis was badmouthing them to the president of the United States, they were completely PO'd with Elvis, and they never met again. And then Elvis died.
Okay, let me clear something up here because I want to have all the facts straight. There are 4 songs you list here of what the Beatles jammed on with Elvis. Blue Suede Shoes.
Yes.
Maybelline. Roll Over Beethoven. And Promised Land. Now, you say that Elvis played the bass and it was plugged into the amplifier.
Yes.
So did John and Paul play acoustic guitars?
Well, all I know is, I'm not a great musicologist, and the type of, I can't tell you exactly the brand of their guitars. I'm sorry, but I would just say that they played guitars to go along with Elvis leading. So Elvis was in charge of them, really, and exactly the make of the guitar. I mean, none of us took notes. None of us sat down and said, "Hey, that's an acoustic guitar. That's a bass." But they somehow made some interesting music, playing the instruments that they were given. Because they never brought their own. I mean, the Elvis Memphis Mafia guy just pulled out guitars, plugged them in, and gave them to them. And I didn't write down, it was this, because we couldn't write them down because we weren't supposed to be there, journalists. We just made mental notes, and when I got out, I wrote it down. But what kind of guitar they played, I can't tell you.
I'm not asking for the make of the guitars,
Yeah.
but But everything was amplified in that room?
Yeah, well, it was amplified to the extent of each of them having something to plug into. And, you know, uh, um, I mean, all I know is they played music together for about 15 minutes. And Elvis seemed to be telling them, I mean, Elvis never said that, let's play Along Tall Sally or anything like that.
Mm.
It was Elvis was in charge, and whatever he did, the Beatles went along with it. And that was the way it was.
And Elvis played the bass to these songs.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was a bass guitar. But again, don't forget, I was a young journalist who knew nothing about guitars, drums, or flutes, or harmonicas. Well, I mean harmonicas, or ukuleles, or banjos, or any of that stuff. All I know is they made some interesting music for a little while until it ended.
Okay.
So for you purists tuning in, I take the Fifth Amendment on that because I can't tell you exactly what guitars they were.
I find it interesting that Elvis liked to have the TV on and the audio off because that's something that John used to do when he lived at the Dakota, especially. You heard
Yeah.
him. So it's a
Well,
similarity
yeah,
there between the two
but
of them.
but 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 don't forget, one of the things was that as I said, Elvis had this 15 to 16-inch giant TV then, okay? And the Beatles, it had come to America when they first came, and they didn't have, they used to change the TV by going up to the TV and twisting a knob
Right.
to the next channel. England didn't have remotes.
Yeah.
And this was the thing. Elvis would just boom, boom, boom. And all of a sudden the Beatles sat there. Wow, that's incredible. On a giant screen of 15 to 16 inches.
Hmm.
That's amazing. And you've got to, to us who've been weaned on 50 to 60 inch, I don't know. I mean, I never had my tape measure out to these giant screens. 15 to 16 inches then was a giant screen.
Right.
I mean, England had black and white little boxes. Anyway, so it's an interesting, yeah.
I understand that. Sometimes people don't understand when I say it was a big deal to see the Beatles help because it was in color. Because 1965 was the big year when a lot of TV shows in America went from black and white to color. And,
Yeah,
it was like, wow. I mean, we take it for granted now.
we do. I mean, if you talk to somebody of like my grandson's age, or they're in their 20 now, and say, can you believe people had television sets that were black and white? They say, Grandpa, what do you mean black and white? I said, they didn't have color. You watch TV in England in black and white? Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it?
Now, this may seem like a simple question to some people, but I got to ask it anyway. But Colonel Tom Parker didn't want any photographs taken. He
Right.
didn't want anything recorded.
Right.
Why was he so adamant about that? This is such a big moment in history.
I know. Well, the reason was that Brian and I saw Brian's on yellow legal pad. No, it was Beverly Hills Hotel paper. He wrote a little memorandum, and I mean, I did have a copy of it somewhere. I know this is terrible, in which he said, we're going to meet Elvis, but I want to make sure that, number one, that media is not there, no tape recorders, no photographers, and make sure that this evening is not credited to any journalistic pressure to have it done. Now, the reason, I mean, I saw it, I've got the exact wordage, and maybe I think I have it in my book. I think I have the line in my book from Brian's memo, exact line, which is along the lines of what I've just described. So this was Brian's thought, and he said George felt the same way. I think the only person that wouldn't have minded a bit of PR was Parker, who was such a showman and such a carny showman.
Mm.
But that was it. But yet, when we arrived in the limos to Elvis's house, there were like about 150 girls outside, and the Beatles were surprised and thought, "Well, what's going on here?" And I think what happened was that Parker tipped off the Elvis fan club, because how else would the girls have known? So it was a setup.
Mm.
But Brian, and I have the wordage. Brian said, "Don't make it an event for press." I mean, it would have been incredible. And the only pictures you've seen and I've seen of John arriving, striding down the driveway as we got out the car into the front door. And I said, we followed, you know, and he knocked at the door and said, is this the home of the king or something, some silly thing, which is John's humor.
Yeah.
And that was it. And there was nobody in there. And I, you know, I stood like trying to be like a fly on the wall for this event. And there was all the Memphis Mafia pieces, and Elvis was there. And of course, Elvis looked like Elvis with his hair. And the other thing I remember vividly of that night was this young girl in her teens with a bouffant hairstyle like 6 feet high. Well, that was Priscilla. That was young Priscilla, who was engaged to Elvis or living with Elvis. I can't remember the exact time. And that was it. And a bunch of the Memphis Mafia and you know, they served fairly good food, some Italian food, some pizza, and it was uncomfortable, as I said, to start, but then it warmed up a bit after Elvis made this joke about going to bed, and about 9, 10 o'clock, I can't remember. I wrote down the exact hour. They all went home and threatening to see each other again, and they never did see each other again.
What I don't understand about this, I understand not wanting this to be a press event, but wouldn't the Beatles themselves have wanted a photo with them and Elvis?
Well, you know, in retrospect, you're absolutely right. I mean, this was an opportunity to meet, particularly John admired Elvis. But Brian specifically wrote this memo saying no cameras. I mean, it is ludicrous. But as you know, there isn't a single picture in existence of the Beatles with Elvis. There isn't one around. And the only pictures, as I said, are kind of rather long-range paparazzi shots of them walking up the driveway.
Right.
I mean, it makes sense. Have a memo picture. I mean, I think what happened was at the end of it all, maybe that was another trip, but I think at the end of it all, Parker gave the Beatles little bags of Western garb and stuff for them, a little gift. And also he gave them, of course, he gave them Elvis's records,
right,
a little package. But I mean, in today's media world, it seems insane to have this meeting of two of the greatest rock people or groups in the world and not have at least one memorial picture. But they said no cameras because, I don't know, maybe Brian was a little bit old-fashioned in his, I mean, he knew PR, but I'm trying to answer your question with a bit of logic, and it doesn't make sense. Why would he not want one picture for history's sake?
right.
And there is not one picture for history's sake. There was not one photographer there. There was none of the Memphis Mafia had cameras. Brian's edict.
Even if they just took a photo with Elvis privately, it could have come out years later. It didn't have to be at that moment. So it doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense. And I don't know, you know, Mal was there, Neil was there, Brian was there, of course. And I'm just trying to think, you know, I mean, when you, in the clear light of today, your question makes great sense. Why no memorial picture? I mean, they worked for a year to get them together. Nothing, not a single thing, nada, nothing. So, you know, there it is. I mean, at least Roosevelt and Churchill and Truman or wherever it was, whoever was president, had their picture together at the end of World War II. But the Beatles and Elvis never pictured together. Go figure.
That really is a shame. Anyway, I say the same thing about John Lennon performed with Elton John at Madison Square Garden.
Yeah. Are there any pictures?
No, there's film footage taken by a fan from the audience that's not professionally shot, but there was no professional film of that performance. It's
but let,
John
yeah,
Lennon with Elton John in New
and
York.
yeah, I mean, I remember the charity thing, and I remember John said Elton was very nervous about doing a live show with him on that occasion. I mean, I did hear that from Bernie Taupin. I think he mentioned that. But you know why? You know, it doesn't make sense, does it?
No.
Why? But I mean, what other question? What other great meetings of people didn't have pictures? I mean, even their own photographer, even if they controlled a photographer to come along and take one picture, it makes sense. But nothing. But Brian said in this memo, no photographers, no tape recorders. Boom.
Hmm. All
So
right.
this is the mystery of Elvis.
The the other encounter that I wanted to talk about was the Beatles with Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
The story has been said many times over that Dylan met the Beatles at the Delmonica Hotel in New York City, and that's where he introduced them to marijuana. And
Yes.
you say that story is not true.
No, I didn't say the story was not true. I said what I saw was, and it makes sense. I vividly remember seeing a sort of a tramp-looking person on the last day of the tour at the motel we were staying at by the airport. It wasn't called Kennedy Airport. It was called whatever the airport was before Kennedy, because they hadn't renamed it. I forget the name of it then. But we were at this inn, and as we went into the reception area, because this was the last night
Hmm.
before the Beatles went home, they'd just done the Paramount charity performance, and they came back to the motel, and all of a sudden, this scruffy-looking guy with a backpack came in, and I said, "There's Bob Dylan." I saw him going, so we all went into the reception area where Brian had provided us with free drinks, and then there was another big suite room with sliding doors, and Dylan went into that room at this motel type hotel, whose name escaped me for the minute.
I have
And
it.
what?
It's the Riviera Idlewild.
Okay, so yes, the airport, the New York airport before Kenny was called the Idlewild Airport. That's right, Riviera Idlewild. And it was not a particularly fancy one, but they didn't need one. It was close to the airport, and that's where we stayed the night before they went back. And so this guy, who turned out to be Bob Dylan because he looked scruffy, goes in, and and then they close the doors, and then we're about 10 feet away, behind the closed shuttered doors, and we're helping ourselves to the free drinks and food that Brian has left for us, and then about an hour later, and then the smell of marijuana permeates through the door, under the door, even though they put towels there,
Hmm.
and then when the door opens, they all there is Ringo on the floor giggling like a child. Brian was pretty high, and the smell kind of enveloped us, and we could have got high from the smell. And then I said to either Malcolm or somebody, "Oh, you guys had a good time," and he said, "Well, what happened was Bob came along with a fat marijuana cigarette, and he gave it to Ringo to smoke." And Ringo, not knowing the procedure, smoked the whole thing himself. Instead of, in those days, I mean, I wasn't into marijuana smoking myself, but everybody knew if you gave them a fat roach of a marijuana cigarette, you take 2 puffs and you pass it on to the next guy.
Hmm.
Ringo thought it was for him. So Ringo was the highest of the lot. And by the time the door opened and the smoke enveloped us, Brian was giggling, Ringo was on the floor, out of this world, and everybody else had imbibed. Now, as I say, maybe they did smoke in New York, but my feeling is that Brian was such a disciplinarian, and the idea of smoking pot, and he knew smoking pot in those days, you could have been placed under arrest, and it would have been a terrible scandal for at the New York, at the Plaza Hotel where they were staying for a couple of days, in the middle of the tour, for them to. I mean, there was security there, in the hallways. to smoke marijuana. Now, Dylan may have come along then, but I know that I saw Dylan and I saw the aftermath of the smoking scene of marijuana at the Idlewild Inn. And I think it was Aronson, the guy from the Saturday Evening Post, who was quite friendly with them, who was a real pothead, wrote for the Saturday Evening Post, got friendly with the Beatles when he wrote a big story when the Beatles first came to America. He was the one that insists the Beatles got stoned with Dylan at the Plaza. He's not around to ask that. He was a bit of a stonehead himself, and I don't, maybe Bob Dylan did it, but the idea that Brian would have got himself involved in an illegal drug, which it was then, doesn't make sense. Brian was like their gatekeeper. Brian was, if he was around, they wouldn't, to take illegal drugs, and marijuana then was illegal. But I saw for myself and I smelt for myself at the Idlewild Hotel, the Idlewild Inn, that this happened, and this is with the aftermath. And there was Dylan, who provided the recreational drugs.
Okay, you make your case there.
Yeah, I mean,
Although
that's it. Yeah.
Okay, you keep saying the Plaza Hotel. You meant the Delmonico, right?
Yeah. The Plaza Hotel was the first one they went to at the Ed Sullivan Show, I think, and then it was the Delmonico. Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with New York, but you're right. It was a Delmonico where I think this guy from the Saturday Evening Post said that he took drugs with Dylan and Beatles. So yes, it was the Delmonico, and the Plaza was, I'm sure, the one they stayed in at the Ed Sullivan Show. I think that was the one. I mean, to be honest with you, it's one of those large New York hotels.
Okay. Before we wrap up our conversation on the Beatles, since you mentioned Ken Womack's book on Mel Evans, which is extraordinary, and he has part 2 coming out later this year with Mel Evans' diaries.
Yes.
A lot of his personal handwritten notes and everything in his archives. What did you observe about Mel Evans? What was he like?
Well, the interesting thing was, I mean, I was stunned in a way when Ken Womack came out with his first book and said that Mal kept a diary. I mean, Mal didn't seem the kind of guy that kept a diary. Mal was a big beef of a man, a very pleasant guy, not really the biggest, the fastest brain in the West, or even in the East, and a pleasant fellow who now that he knew I was part of the family was very helpful. But he was their bodyguard, he was their schlepper, he was there with Neil. They brought all the stuff on stage, and so Mal was always pleasant, and I knew that Mal was the keeper, and with a little help from Neil, was a keeper to the rooms. So if a girl wanted to meet it, you had to go through Mal. He provided the passport to get through. But he was always very pleasant. I mean, and I hate to keep saying this, but he didn't. I mean, he was a bodyguard at the Cavern. He was a guard at the Cavern. He drove them around, and he kept his little bag with all the necessary accoutrements that the Beatles, if the umbrellas or other rubbers and all the rest of it. Somebody described in one of the reviews of Ken's book, which was a bit tough, as being a kind of Mary Poppins with a drug bag, or something like that. And so always very pleasant, and did a lot of work, and worked almost, lowly paid. We didn't realize how lowly paid until Ken wrote his book, and when, considering the Beatles were earning all this money, but he was devoted to the Beatles so much and this was his life, and Ken spells that out brilliantly in his book.
I know it's one of the most essential books you'll ever get.
Yes.
On the Beatles or anyone in the Beatles family. And what would you say about Neil?
I mean, don't forget, Neil also started out with them in the early days. He started out with them when they were driving, a beat up old car around the countryside, around the country, going to gigs. And he was there from day one. And then they again, he was more of a mouthpiece. If you couldn't get it from Brian or you couldn't get it from Derek, you could talk to Neil and he would tell you what was going on. So he was very good. He was very close. He kept the money. If the Beatles wanted any money, which they didn't need, he would hand it out. And also, I think he was also a keeper of the Prellies as well. So he was like Mal was kind of a gatekeeper. And, you know, they were kind of instrumental in access and egress to the Beatles suite. And he went on, his loyalty was repaid, as you know, by becoming the head of Apple. And unfortunately, I think he did a good job with them. He was in the anthology. He talked about a lot in the anthology because he was there from day one. And the Beatles knew loyalty, and Neil was very loyal. And of course, and then of course, sadly, he died of I think some kind of cancer. Yeah, I don't know whether it's throat cancer or whatever. And was devoted to the Beatles. It was his life, and I think he did a good job at Apple, and they gave him gave him the rewards he deserved. But a loyal servant.
Okay. All right. Finally, why would you say, in your humble opinion, the Beatles catalog has endured for so long? You know, there's a lot of music from the past that you don't hear anymore, whether that's right or wrong, being exposed on the radio or on streaming services. But I want just your opinion because, you know, I can think this is the greatest catalog that ever existed. I don't expect everybody in the world to feel the same way as I do, but you always find some new generations of fans that find out about it. And they're always in the news. There's always interest levels in them. There's always new books coming out,
Yeah.
like yours. Oh, by the way, let me make sure I don't forget to ask you this question. What's in the revised book that wasn't in the original?
Well, there's 50 questions that I'm always asked about the Beatles. And in answering those questions, there's a rich addition to what I write about in my book. I've tried to avoid, of course, repeating the stuff that's in my original book. Also, it talks about my motivation of why I wrote my book in the first place, which was basically, I don't want to get into too detail, but upon the death of my wife of 46 years, I said, what am I going to do? And then I thought, I know about the Beatles, and isn't it about time I wrote about them? So that helped me through a difficult time in my life. But the opportunity to write about things that I never touched upon because I never knew, and sort of bring things up to date-ish. And then I love the idea of, I found a great filmmaker who'd made a film, a documentary that I saw and liked 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, or maybe less, in which he had all the movie stars and celebrities talking about why they were in awe of the Beatles. And I thought those stories were absolutely, we're talking about, Joan Baez and people who spoke honestly about what the Beatles meant to them, and they were in awe of them. And I thought that was kind of fun. So it's got about 100 pages of that. And then I found a lot of great photographers who I became friends with, who've given me, like Harry Benson, who is a brilliant photographer and wasn't on the 64 tour, but was with the Beatles when they got off the plane to go to Ed Sullivan. And Harry met them in Paris and shot them in Paris when they heard that they were #1 in the American hit parade. And Harry is a brilliant photographer. He's a friend, and we've worked together for many years, and he provided me with some great pictures, some new pictures that weren't in the original book. So there's a lot more richness and bring you up to date with the 50 questions, everything from, and when I talked to Sting about why he was influenced by the Beatles, other rock people, Elton John, why, and people like that, who gave me a new insight in the kind of questions you would ask Elton John. Were you influenced by the Beatles? There's hardly a rock star who was not influenced by the Beatles. It's unbelievable. You wouldn't believe it, but that's the case. So it has a lot more heavyweight stuff in it, serious stuff, funny stuff. The story I told you about Paul McCartney, how much are the Beatles worth? How much are the Beatles not worth? Where the funds come from, where their fortunes come from. And last time I saw Ringo and stories about Ringo. And so it's a lot of added stuff I've been able to get, because you are now, Ken, you are now a member of my Beatle family, because I mean, you are an expert on this now. Can you count on 20 hands how many new friends you've made thanks to the Beatles? There's a Yiddish word called mishpocha,
Yep.
which means family.
Right.
And in a strange, bizarre way, my new family is the Beatles family.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't deliberately go out to do it, but it happened. And so it's kind of, I mean, I did 14-year-old podcasters who know more about the Beatles than I do. I
Hmm.
mean, it's amazing. And the answer, getting back to your original question,
Yeah.
the music is so perennial, evergreen. There's new stuff. And I find I spoke the other day to a group of about 60 people, and they had a 14-year-old boy there who came up to me and asked me some questions about the Beatles that I couldn't, it blew my mind. He knew about their music, he knew about the albums. So there it is, what you said 5 minutes ago. There are young people who get in the Beatles spell, and they love it,
Mhm.
and somehow their songs appeal to everyone, all ages and new generations.
Right. Even in the 60s, they used to say, especially when the Beatles music matured more, and you had songs like Yesterday creeping in and
Yeah,
Rigby and those songs, that they were appealing not just to teenagers, but to parents and then later to grandparents.
that's right.
So even in the 60s, people were saying that.
So
Actually.
look, would you concur, Ken, that there's no other group on the face of the earth that has such a wide appeal? I mean, the Stones. You come up with some other groups. I mean, maybe Swift. But it's too early. There's no other group that's been so perennial, that's so universally loved and admired wherever I go.
Hmm.
But it's like I have a magic wand. I mentioned the Beatles. They tell me, kids, teenagers, amazing.
Well, it's just a pretty miraculous thing to witness. Just in the case of the Beatles catalog as a group, not only are the songs powerful and strong as compositions, but they're so diverse. There's so
Yes,
many different styles of music to appeal to all different types of people with different musical tastes. You might like the ballads more, you might be more of a rocker, you might want something more that's edgy, like I Want You, She's So Heavy, for example, or Your Blues, one of those songs. You might want something that's more classical, like Yesterday, She's Leaving Home, Eleanor Rigby. You might
yeah,
want a children's song like Yellow Submarine. You might want the Indian music that George Harrison brought in with Within You, Without You, and those songs. There's so much variety within the music. And I think even early on, um, they were aware, and Brian Epstein was aware. I always like to bring up that first Ed Sullivan appearance because, it was very clever to not only start with All My Lovin', which immediately Paul sings right into the song, leaps right in. It's so catchy. It's a vital part of the song is the fact that there is no introduction other than Paul's vocal. And then you got Till There Was You.
yeah,
You got a show tune there.
yeah,
So it was very, I think, very conscientious of what they chose to do in that
yes,
first show, because a song like Till There Was You, if you knew the music of the Music Man, oh wow,
yeah.
maybe the parents will like this group. So I think from the very beginning they were aware of having a lot of variety in the group. Brian in particular wanted to make sure, especially with the BBC recordings, that George was represented and
Yeah.
George could sing a lot of songs. So you got to know all four members very well. Ringo got to sing a few songs. They brought it out in their press conferences. They tried to make sure that they all got represented. They got represented in their films. All four of them became known as their own personalities. All that played a part. And the music, as I said, I think the fact that it's so eclectic, it's kind of impossible not to like some part of that catalog. Its songs are
Well,
so great, you know.
you're absolutely right. And one of the things I add is all the famous singers who've done cover versions of Beatles songs in such a variety of ways.
Yep.
I mean, this is not a cover song, but one of my favorites, believe it or not, is Peter Sellers reciting A Hard Day's Night. Have you seen
Right.
that?
Yes.
I mean, it's hilarious.
Right.
And Sellers was a friend of Ringo and a friend of the Beatles. So Peter
Friend of,
Sellers, great
yeah,
comic
what?
genius, does A Hard Day's Night in his recitation for Laurence Olivier voice.
Right.
Wow.
And that's proof of how great the catalog is when you've got so many different renditions of their songs.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. Amazing.
Classical albums with classical arrangements of Beatles songs. You got bluegrass albums.
Yeah.
You got all children's albums. You know, you could have Motown sings the Beatles. You've got that. You get there's so many different approaches to their music. You've got hard rock bands covering the Beatles, you know,
Oh, yeah.
Aerosmith or Motley Crue or whatever. So that's part of it. So
Yeah.
anyway, why don't we just briefly talk about this other life that you've had besides the Beatles? Because it's extraordinary when you look at it. I'm reading actually the email that you first sent me, which is a great summation of some of the things that you achieved in your career. That you penned a weekly entertainment column for the New York Times Syndicate, and you interviewed some names, some of the biggest names in show business. Cary Grant, Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Tom Cruise, you mentioned before, Muhammad Ali. That wasn't when the Beatles met Muhammad Ali.
No, it wasn't. It
Yeah,
was
that was
it,
much
it was
later.
just after he retired from boxing and then went back. Yeah.
Okay. And Jane Fonda. Um, you were there, you were smuggled, it says, in 1962 on the campus of riot-torn University of Mississippi when James Meridith was enrolled as the first ever Black student on campus. And then 3 years later, you were there for the Los Angeles Watts riots.
Yes.
It's oh my God.
Yeah.
You're there for everything. This is extraordinary. You were at the Ambassador Hotel. What a tragic
Yes.
moment when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. You were one of the boys on the bus chronicling the life of actor turned politician Ronald Reagan when he campaigned for governor of California. You covered some of the biggest trials, Sirhan Sirhan, who
Yeah.
killed Bobby Kennedy. Angela Davis. Ironically, John and Yoko wrote the song for Angela Davis. Daniel Ellsburg's trial for leaking the Pentagon Papers, and also the Manson trials as well. And you put out a book about that, right?
I did. I've written two books on the Manson murders. Yeah.
You've done everything.
Well, yeah, but yeah, I'm still doing things. So happily I am. Yeah. Thank you.
So, of all those other events and activities in your life, what really stands out for you? They're all so amazing to even talk about. What
Yeah.
was it like to be there, at the Ambassador Hotel when that was?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to say that because when I was with Bobby Kennedy that night, I had traveled for 3 or 4 days beforehand across California, and he was going to be, and it turned out he won California and was going to be nominated by the Democratic Party for president. And I'd seen Kennedy up close because we traveled with him. I saw his hands at the end of 4 days, which were raw from shaking hands with people. And because in those days you could, when the candidate came, you touched them, you felt them, and I saw the California field workers almost worship him with a guy called Cesar Chavez, who was their farm leader, who joined Kennedy on the road. And when we got to the Ambassador Hotel, it was going to be a sweet night because Kennedy won the California election and had enough votes to go to Chicago for the convention and be nominated. It would have happened. And then, you follow Bobby as he goes into the kitchen for a press conference and goes in through the kitchen, and then suddenly you hear balloons popping, but they're not balloons, they're guns. And you walk into the access the alcove of the kitchen, and there is Bobby lying on the ground with Ethel saying, "Give him air." And there's my photographer, Harry Benson, back again, who's with me on this campaign, standing on the kitchen sink taking pictures. And Harry's pictures, if you look them up, are horrifyingly real, of Bobby and Ethel and him dying on the floor. And it's one of the things that to watch somebody being assassinated after the assassination is something that will never go away. And all the other stories you mentioned were interesting and fascinating, and I met some great people. I mean, Ali was brilliant. Ali was funny. Ali was Ali. I mean, he was just a loudmouth, but what an entertainer, what a speaker, what a boxer. And all those stories, I know we'd have time to go on, but it's been hard days, years, actually. Sorry about that. It's terrible. But what I'm going to do is, once I get a chance, I've written a memoir about my dealings with some of the showbiz people, about Ali and Tom Cruise and Paul Newman and and Taylor and Burton, which are fun. It's yeah, excuse me. Yeah. Okay. So somebody just waved at me. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it's been a terrific ride, and I'm still writing, and there we go. I'm still writing and riding. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Well, this has been quite a thrill to talk to you here.
Yes.
You're welcome anytime you want to.
Well, thank you so much. And you have been, it's terrific. It's always great to talk to somebody who knows their stuff, and you know your stuff. So I want to thank you, Ken, for giving me the time to sound off. And I hope I didn't go on too long, but I can get a bit answer the question, Ivor, and then get on with the thing. But thank you very much for having me on, and let me know. There you go, the Beatles and Me on tour. Terrific. You can get it at Amazon, probably the easiest place. And I hope you enjoy it. And thank you for your time very much.
Just want to say that you can also get Ivor's book on Ivor Davis Books.
Yeah, ivordavisbook.com, which is my book website. Great to talk to you, and thank you so much for your time and your questions and your knowledge.
Thank you, Ivor, and thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here we go.
Okay.